everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out. This is going to be a longer video, so we're going to kind of skip the intro. And you may have noticed on the YouTube side of things that I'm already super small and tiny. And that is because I have court documents that we're going to be talking about in this video. So I went ahead and cut myself down to size so that you guys could better see what we will be talking about. In today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about Aileen Wuornos. And the reason I settled on this topic in this deep dive is because my sister Leslie was actually watching one of Netflix's documentaries on Aileen Wuornos. Consequently, because the internet spies on you, I got a lot of videos on TikTok pertaining to different trends surrounding Aileen, mostly people replicating infamous prison pictures, and it occurred to me that a lot of folks don't know the true story about Aileen Wuornos outside of the mythos and legend that it has taken on over time. Namely that Aileen Wuornos was not a good person. She definitely was a sympathetic person, but she made a lot of really bad choices and ended up affecting a lot of innocent people's lives. So I did my due diligence. I did quite a bit of research. Links to all pertinent research that I did are going to be down in the description, so if you want to follow along, you are more than welcome to do so. Now, naturally, we're going to do this in chronological order as much as possible, which means we're going to start with Aileen's early life. Aileen was originally born as Aileen Carol Pittman and was born on February 29th, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. Aileen's mother was Diane Wuornos, who was aged 14 when she married to Aileen's father, 18-year-old Leo Pittman. So right off the bat, that is a big red flag. We don't like that because the biggest standout is the fact that Diane is 4 years younger than Leo. And as far as I'm concerned, which I think you guys can all agree with, a 14-year-old has no business being with an 18-year-old, let alone romantically, and let alone through marriage. So right off the bat, we can kind of say circumstances aren't the best, and these circumstances, unfortunately, are going to impact Keith, who was Aileen's older brother, as well as Aileen. So, keep that in mind as we progress. And I acknowledge the fact that Aileen's mother probably has a lot of context behind her, but we can't really afford to dive into that because this episode is about Aileen, and then we'd also be here until the cows come home. So just understand that there's already a bunch of can of worms that have not been opened pertaining to Diane, but Diane and her choices and the issues in her life do impact Aileen. On March 14th, 1955, Diane gave birth to Aileen's older brother, Keith Wuornos, as I mentioned earlier. Keith will actually become an important part of Aileen's background and her story later, so just keep in mind that he exists. I'll talk about him here and there, but just a name that you're going to want to remember. Less than 2 years after being married, Diane and Leo filed for divorce. At the time of the divorce, Diane was 2 months away from giving birth to Aileen. So already we see not only the fact that she's a mother of one, she is now not going to have a partner to help her raise her children, and she is also going to have a second child. All of this happens at the time that Diane is 16 years old, which means that she not only has a toddler, but a newborn baby, is freshly divorced, and she can barely drive a car. So I can only imagine the amount of stress that she endured in this situation, and it informs her later decision to ultimately abandon Aileen and Keith. As for what happened to Leo after the divorce, well, he's not really a winner either, because in 1967 he was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl. Like I said, not a winner. Thankfully, Aileen didn't end up meeting her father. She lived life without knowing him, which I personally think is probably for the best. That said, Leo was diagnosed with schizophrenia and then ultimately committed suicide by hanging in prison on January 30th, 1969. Now, Leo's violent history and mental health diagnosis, while dark in nature, will actually shed some light on Aileen later on. Now, when Aileen was just 4 years old and Keith was roughly 6 years old, they were abandoned by Diane, as I mentioned. Diane actually placed both of her children in the care of their grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. And both grandparents adopted Aileen and Keith. However, Britta and Lori had issues of their own, namely that they were both alcoholics. Now, Aileen would later claim that her grandfather, Laurie, not only beat her but sexually abused her as well. specifically asking Aileen to strip out of her clothes before the beatings occurred. And in one instance, other children in the neighborhood actually asked Aileen what she was doing because Aileen stated that she was looking for a willow branch to be used as a switch for when she was beaten by Laurie. Aside from Keith as her brother, Aileen also had 2 older adoptive siblings, which were her biological aunt and uncle. Around the age of 10 or 11, Wuornos learned that her parents, Laurie and Britta, were actually her biological grandparents and not her biological parents. This led to a lot of social media at the time. I say social media loosely because the internet was just coming around, but there were a lot of comparisons between Aileen and Ted Bundy because Ted Bundy had a very similar situation. Once Aileen learned that both of her parents had lied to her and Keith, their relationship worsened, which is to be expected because that's a really big secret to keep from somebody for a very long time. On top of that, Laurie was documented as a harsh man who focused on disciplinarian-based structure. In some accounts, Laurie is said to have had Wuornos watch him drown a kitten. Not a great guy. At other times, Aileen described sadistic abuse at the hands of her grandfather. Aileen openly discussed numerous beatings, most of which occurred with a leather strap, where Laurie used the leather strap on her bare buttocks. This was, unfortunately, something that was pretty common at the time. Doesn't make it right, it's just not something that would have stood out as particularly concerning at the time. Then, on several occasions, Aileen stated she was required to lay face down, naked and spread eagle on a bed where she was also whipped. On top of this, Aileen described being beaten on consecutive days in a row while her skin was still raw and bloody and healing from prior assaults. This was corroborated by fellow school children who described seeing Aileen walking funny or crying out in pain for what appeared to be no reason, because as far as they knew, she wasn't being beaten, she wasn't being hurt. Obviously, this wasn't the case. These have been documented incidents. Eileen's grandfather often told her while she was being beaten, quote, "Aileen, you are evil, wicked, worthless, and you should not have been born. You are not worthy of the air you breathe," end quote. Obviously not great things that you're going to want to say to a child in their impressionable years, and this behavior kind of makes it clear why Aileen later said that she absolutely hated and despised her parents. Backing these claims as well is Sydney Chauvin, who was a neighbor that claimed to witness physical abuse done by Laurie to Aileen, such as grabbing Aileen by the hair and dragging her inside the house. Sydney also claimed that she heard Keith and Aileen had sex. Keep in mind, they are biologically related. They are siblings through and through. Cynthia DeMalje, sister of Sydney, was aware that Aileen was impregnated in her teens by an older man on the block by the name of Mr. Potlock. DeMalje went on to recall a party where Aileen was on the floor and claimed that her brother had, quote, banged her. Aileen's sister, biological aunt, by the name of Laurie, then came over and threw water in Eileen's face, which led to Aileen running out of the room crying. So obviously there is a lot going on here. Not only was she raped by somebody on the block, it sounds like there was some incest going on as well, both between Aileen and Laurie, her grandfather, as well as Keith, her brother. People were quoted as describing Keith and Eileen's relationship as particularly close in a way that didn't sit right with them. And as somebody who is also particularly close with my siblings, I feel like it's easy to differentiate what is a healthy type of closeness and what isn't. Granted, both Aileen and Keith did not exactly have a great childhood, so the fact that this occurred, while inappropriate and wrong, isn't that unlikely. So just keep that in mind as well. We are very much not off to a great start. By age 11, it's reported that Aileen engaged in sexual behavior, which is incredibly young, and she did this at school with others in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, foods, and what other items it was that she wanted. This would ultimately begin her career as a prostitute. It is also reported that at some point in Eileen's childhood, she very openly began to engage in sexual conduct with Keith. Originally, it was sort of secretive, and then at a certain point, apparently, allegedly, it became a little bit more obvious. By 14, as I mentioned earlier, Aileen was raped and impregnated by a local man known as Mr. Potlock. That is one version of the story. The pregnancy was said to have been either Mr. Potluck's, a kid from school, Keith, or Laurie, her grandfather's. Nobody really knew for certain. Regardless, she did get pregnant. And Aileen offered multiple explanations for how she ultimately became pregnant. But the most accepted one, as far as what I can tell in articles and research, is that it was due to rape, and that the most likely suspect or culprit of that was Mr. Potluck. Aileen consequently, as I mentioned, became pregnant from the rape, and it's noted that Mr. Potluck was a friend of many people in the neighborhood, including Laurie, her grandfather. It's also noted in some accounts that Mr. Potluck was known to be a pedophile, and that this behavior was known amongst children. However, he was viewed as by other adults as like the grandpa on the block. As a result, when Aileen gave birth to a son, Laurie, her grandfather, forced her to give up the child for adoption. So, whenever it seems like it can't get worse for Aileen, it does. This poor girl went through so freaking much, and this is why she's such a sympathetic individual, because she really got screwed over as a kid. She got the short end of the stick, which you'll find that all of this ends up influencing the way that she turns out. Shortly after giving birth, Aileen dropped out of school. Though it's documented that she wasn't exactly consistent in her attendance in the first place, she often became truant. She didn't show up to school a lot, and in fact, she spent a lot of time on the streets because she would run away, and if she wasn't running away, she had lengthy stays in the local juvenile detention centers. So, given the circumstances so far, Aileen really, she kind of embraced a life of crime at this point. She really fell into it. A lot of people state that she just kind of accepted her role as this prostitute. Granted, she's only a teenager, but she was just basically resolute in living a life of crime because she was, that's what people labeled her as. A prostitute, a whore, she was just going to live up to their expectations because realistically, what other chance did she have? And it's really sad to say that, but that was kind of her sentiment surrounding it. At the same time that Aileen dropped out of school, her grandmother Britta died of liver failure. Remember, both Laurie and Britta were alcoholics, which contributed to Britta's death. And then less than 5 years later, in March of 1976, Laurie actually died by suicide. And this is documented in Sue Russell's book, Lethal Intent. It's stated that Aileen didn't attend the funeral, which isn't too surprising given how much of a piece of shit Laurie is, but these are all markers that we're going to want to keep in mind for later, namely the fact that not only did Aileen's biological father commit suicide, but her biological grandfather committed suicide as well. Then, at the ripe age of 15, prior to Laurie's death, she was actually kicked out of the house by Laurie because he basically had enough with her. And this led to Aileen not only being homeless, but supporting herself through further prostitution and then living in the nearby woods. And this really became the start of her long and violent criminal career. While Aileen is most known for the murders she would eventually commit, she actually has an extensive history of violent crime prior to those murders. So now we're going to get into her criminal record, at least some of the most documented incidents. So on May 27th, 1974, at age 18, Aileen was arrested in Jefferson County, Colorado for driving under the influence, disorderly conduct, and then firing a .22 caliber pistol from a moving vehicle. When Aileen's court date came and passed, she didn't show, and that ultimately led to a warrant for failing to appear. At this point, Aileen was like, screw it, I'm done. We're going to set some new we see some new horizons. We're going to go out over yonder. And she ultimately hitchhiked out to Florida. And this journey of hers would be her introduction to Florida, where she would eventually kill 7 men. Though some speculate that she actually had additional victims, they just weren't able to ever tie those to her. Once in Florida, Aileen met a 69-year-old yacht club owner by the name of Louis Gratz Fell. And given Louis's wealth, this was a perfect opportunity for Aileen to have a comfortable life, to settle down, and not only have security for once, but maybe even get the help that she very clearly and so desperately needed. Aileen kind of had this idea in mind, which is partially why she married Louis. And Louis was interested in having a younger wife. And because of how big the age difference was, their marriage was plastered all over local newspapers. But despite how in love they appeared to be, their marriage fell apart pretty quick because Aileen, in her mind, did not have the security that she wanted. And this realistically wasn't Lewis's fault. It stated that he provided for her well beyond what he honestly should have, because she drank, she got in fights all the time, she spent all of his money whenever she could. And again, I understand why. She had a really shitty childhood. But a lot of people try to point the finger at Lewis as this disrespectful piece of shit husband who didn't do anything for her, and that's just not true. He tried, but Aileen had so many issues going on that it just wasn't enough. Ultimately, it seemed that Eileen's past was bogging her down, and like I said, despite the money, despite the security and her marriage to Lewis, she just continued to engage in criminal behavior. Aileen actually became a regular at a nearby bar where she frequently caused disturbances and was just generally disorderly. She actually racked up some additional assault charges during her time at the bar and throughout her marriage with Lewis, because shortly after marrying Lewis, she actually attacked him and beat him with his own cane. Because of the attack, Lewis divorced her and then requested a restraining order against her. I can't say that I really blame him. Aileen is quoted as stating, "He actually started the argument. He actually started the fight." This man is about 70 years old. Granted, he could be capable of doing that, but in my experience, 70-year-old people usually aren't the ones getting into domestic violence incidences. And I live in a town that is full of nothing but old retired people. So I'm not really inclined to believe her on that one, and we'll learn later that Aileen is very much a pathological liar. So once she was divorced, Aileen moved back to Michigan, where she got into more trouble, where she got more assault charges at a local bar known as Bernie's Club when she used a pool cue ball to assault the bartender. Not a good look. So yeah, we can see already that this is just not going to go well. Around this time, Keith actually died of esophageal cancer, which led to Aileen inheriting $10,000 from his life insurance. And at this time, Aileen was arrested and fined for yet another DUI, which she used her inheritance from Keith's death to pay. And within weeks, the money was gone because she spent it on all sorts of luxuries, but mostly expensive cars, which she ended up crashing, which tends to be a behavior of hers that we see later on, as well as the drinking and the substance abuse. Granted, her grandparents were both alcohols, so I mean, realistically, are we that surprised that she's going to kind of follow in their footsteps? Not really. Not at all, actually. So once Eileen's troubled behavior worsened, at the age of 22, she actually attempted suicide by shooting herself in the stomach. And it's noted that between ages 14 and 22, she actually attempted suicide 6 times. So clearly, given her grandfather's suicide, her biological father's suicide, and now her suicide attempts, there's something going on there. There's clear mental health issues that are running in the family that are not being taken care of and are allowed to grow and fester. So once more, we can see that there's a genetic component to the behavior that is taking place. On May 20th, 1981, Aileen was arrested in Edgewater, Florida for the armed robbery of a convenience store where she stole $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes. This armed robbery was the first of her eventual robberies, and it was actually an indication of future behavior that would lead to her killing 7 men. After serving prison time for this offense, Aileen gained further charges after forging checks and stealing a gun along with ammunition. Then in January of 1986, Aileen was arrested again for vehicle theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. June 2nd, 1986, Volusia County deputy sheriffs actually detained Aileen for questioning after a male companion accused her of pulling a gun in his car and demanding $200. Again, indicative of her future crimes and her armed robberies. Aileen at the time was found to be carrying spare ammunition, and police discovered a .22 caliber pistol under the passenger seat she occupied. So clearly, we're at a point where her prior criminal history is going to be a massive indicator for her future criminal history. As Eileen's life continued to veer out of control, her violent tendencies really just marred her record as a whole. But Aileen actually met Tyra Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach when she was only 24. And if anyone thought that Eileen's life would be taking a great upward turn upon meeting Tyra, they were going to be in for a rude awakening. Aileen actually moved into a hotel with Tyra where she supported both of them by working as a prostitute. Tyra is an interesting character in this story because when we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I think she was more involved in what was going on than she ultimately admits, and I think she should have been looked at more than she ultimately was, but you'll see what I'm talking about when we get there. So during this time, both Aileen and Tyra got in trouble for assaulting someone at a bar, shocker, with a beer bottle. Then Wuornos would go on to murder 7 men within 12 months. All of the men were motorists, white males between the ages of 40 and 65. A similar description as that of her grandfather, so I do think that's partially why she ended up picking the people that she did. So her first victim is Richard Mallory. Richard Mallory was age 51, and he was an electronics store owner in Clearwater. Mallory was the first of Eileen's victims, and perhaps the most controversial, because Aileen would claim multiple versions around her killing of Mallory, but there seemed to be one consistent aspect, which is that there was a struggle surrounding a gun and an attempted rape. On December 1st, 1989, a deputy in Volusia County discovered an abandoned vehicle belonging to Richard Mallory. His body was found December 13th, so 12 days later, several miles away in a wooded area. Mallory had been shot several times, but two bullets to the left lung were found to have caused hemorrhaging and ultimately his death when there was a medical examiner who came to that conclusion, examined the body, did the autopsy, all that jazz. Aileen claimed that Mallory beat, raped, and sodomized her after he drove her to an abandoned area for sexual services. Mallory, as I mentioned, was Eileen's first victim, and her reason for killing him was self-defense. That's what she claimed. However, Eileen's story does change a lot, and what was later revealed in court documents is that both Mallory and Aileen were heavily intoxicated at the time of the murder. Aileen frequently drank, especially when she was working as a prostitute, which is not that uncommon. Prostitution as a job is not particularly great, and a lot of people resort to alcohol or other substances to get through a day of working because it's a difficult way of living. Aileen was also known to carry a small caliber gun. Aileen went to a motel she shared with Tyra shortly after the crime and then confessed to shooting a man and robbing him of his belongings before ultimately dumping his body in the woods. At the time, Tyra didn't know it, but this man was Richard Mallory. Moore then attempted to extract a confession from Aileen at a later point pertaining to Mallory's death. Attorneys actually ended up advising Aileen not to speak to law enforcement, and Aileen ignored her attorney's advice, eventually confessing to Mallory's death, to killing Mallory, as well as others. She initially stated that Mallory picked her up while she was hitchhiking. She then went into the woods to engage in prostitution, and then Aileen stated that she feared Mallory was going to, quote, roll her, which means, like, rape her and not pay. And then she went for her gun, which led to a struggle. And that brings us to our first image here, this little highlighted section. At this point, she grabbed a bag in which she kept a gun, and the two began struggling over possession of the bag. Wuornos said she prevailed, pointed the gun at Mallory, and said, "You son of a bitch, I knew you were going to rape me." Aileen said that Mallory responded, "No, I wasn't. No, I wasn't." At this point, Aileen told law officers she shot Mallory at least once while he still was sitting behind the steering wheel. So, there's a little bit to analyze there. Which is mainly that, and here's the thing, I'm going to caveat this early on because I know people are going to get upset. Do I think that there's a high likelihood and a high chance that Mallory did try to rape her? Absolutely, I do. And we'll realize later that that's because he has a history of doing this before. And there is a saying in law enforcement that past behavior is indicative of future behavior. So do I think that there is a high chance that that happened? Yes, absolutely, I do. What I have a hard time with is that he was shot while sitting behind the steering wheel. To me, that doesn't sound like self-defense. And Eileen's story will change multiple times. And like I said, the most consistent part throughout it is that there was a struggle for her gun at some point, and that at some point he either did rape her or tried to rape her. So, I think given the consistencies, he at the very least did try to rape her. But in the initial story that she provides, it is questionable in her phrasing how much of that was actually self-defense. And that's not me saying that I don't believe her point blank, period. It's just from a defense perspective, that's going to be something that's difficult to prove. That's going to be an issue later on. So at this point, Aileen tells officers she shot Mallory multiple times and then eventually picked through his pockets and then concealed his body, at which point she left in his car. Aileen also told officers she had given Tyra inconsistent stories about what had happened. So she was basically saying, hey, don't rely on her for information because I've told her like 6 different versions. Now, in another version, Aileen stated that she told Tyra she found a dead body hidden under a scrap of rug in the woods, which is how she got items from Mallory. In another version, she confessed to the killing to Tyra. And then in like another version entirely, Aileen stated that she and Mallory sat, drank, smoked marijuana, agreed to have sex in the woods. And then when engaging in the sex act, Mallory stated he didn't actually have the money, only wanted to unzip his pants, and then tied her hands to the steering wheel of the car, claiming he would kill her like he had with other, quote, sluts. So again, very inconsistent stories. Obviously, there's the 2 aspects that seem to be similar throughout. But the difficult thing is we're never actually going to know what happened because Aileen is such a pathological liar. It is very, very difficult to determine what is and isn't the truth. And like I said, I think we can agree that yes, there was a fight over the gun. Yes, Mallory did get shot. That's proven. And yes, he either tried to rape her or he did rape her. Those, I think, are non-negotiables because they are consistent throughout every version. But the details leading up to it, what they may have done or have not done together, like, we're never going to know that. And I think that's important for people to understand and realize is that with Eileen's case in particular, there is a lot of uncertainty. At this point, Aileen claimed Mallory then violently raped her anally and vaginally before pouring alcohol on the resulting wounds. Mallory then untied her, and believing that he was going to kill her, Aileen fought back. She went for her gun, as she stated in the original version, which led to a struggle, and then she ultimately shot Mallory. We're going to go ahead and jump to our second image, and we're going to focus right here. Aileen also confessed that she took some of Mallory's property and pawned it. Some of his property later was found in a rented warehouse unit used by Wuornos. More than a year later, she took the murder weapon and threw it into Rose Bay, south of the motel where she was staying at the time. Moore, aka Tyra, later showed law officers where to find the gun. Grooves in the gun were similar to markings found on the fatal bullets, though an expert testified that the particular grooves were fairly common and could be found in other weapons. So, like I said in that little court document right there, she confessed to robbing Mallory, which is something that we also have to take into consideration, especially when we look at other victims. Aileen openly admits that her intent with every victim was to rob them. Whether that was the intent from start to finish with Mallory, debatable. But later, when it comes to her other victims, that was the intent. The intent was robbery. And I know people are going to be like, oh, but you just said that she was a pathological liar. Yes, but also when you look at the crimes themselves, they are indicative and they do signify the fact that she robbed people. I mean, she very clearly robbed Mallory. Whether that was her intention before she hitchhiked and got into his car or after she killed him and was basically giving him the middle finger for the assault that happened, again, I don't know, but robbery did take place. Robbery was a motive that is part of the case, so just keep that in mind. Don't jump down my throat. I'm trying to be as objective as I can here. Anywho, like I said earlier, it later became known that Mallory had previously been convicted of attempted rape in Maryland. According to Tyra, Aileen didn't make any sort of mention of this until she actually went to trial. And neither did the prosecutors, which kind of makes sense because they are trying to get a conviction. I don't agree with that. I think that's inappropriate. I think that that is pertinent information that should have been admitted. The judge basically told the defense, hey, guess what? We're not doing that. And I do think that that was a failure on the justice system's part. That is pertinent information, especially because when we get into Aileen's case itself, her criminal history was allowed to be entered, but Mallory's wasn't. So, a little bit controversial there. I don't like the way that that played out. Tyra would state that she never mentioned Mallory's history to Aileen. It sounds like there's some discrepancy on who knew what and when. Regardless, it's an important fact to know Mallory did have these past behaviors. During the appeals process for Mallory's trial, which was the first one, court documents noted the following. Defense did not use voluntary intoxication defense. And Jenkins, one of Aileen's attorneys, stated she believed Wuornos was an alcoholic, which again would not be that surprising given her grandparents and the clear issues throughout her family. Jenkins actually stated that Aileen was heavily intoxicated at the time of the crime, as was Mallory. But I'm going to show you good old picture number 3. So we're going to read the highlighted part again. Jenkins explained, quote, my feeling about the voluntary intoxication defense at that time was that, 1, it was not in keeping with what my client wanted to do, because remember, Aileen wanted the self-defense defense. 2, it was not consistent with her ability to remember what I considered to be very specific details as to what had occurred between her and Mr. Mallory. I thought it would be inconsistent with our defense. Additionally, it's been my experience that a voluntary intoxication defense is not effective. So there was another issue that followed this up, which was not calling truck driver Tom Evans to the stand as a defense witness. Jenkins testified that she thought about calling him as a witness, but ended up finding he was not very credible. I'll find her specific statement here, which is... As for not calling truck driver Tom Evans, Jenkins testified that she thought about calling him as a witness, but found he was not very credible. Also, Jenkins testified he made unrealistic demands upon the defense, quote, and we found him to be fairly incredible, and at that point he said that he would not be willing to provide testimony unless he was provided with a condo on the beach here in Daytona, that he wanted in excess of $100 a day, plus expenses for himself and I believe 2 others, and he wanted a chauffeur and a limousine, end quote. And finally, Jenkins testified that appellant, which would be Aileen, claimed to not know the truck driver. Interesting that this would come up in an appeal later on, if Aileen herself said, yeah, I don't know who that guy is. So again, just issues with the legal proceedings in the case itself. The fact that they even considered bringing this guy to be a witness is crazy to me, because the prosecution would have picked him to shreds and been like, oh, cool, so you're only testifying here to, benefit yourself. So I think the defense team ultimately deciding against it was probably the best decision, but I am curious as to why this was brought up in the appeals, because to me, that seems like the appropriate decision to make, because the prosecution otherwise is going to have a freaking field day with that. Then we have another attorney by the name of Mr. Miller, who was also at the appeals situation. So, Mr. Miller stated that while her drinking may have been relevant to a self-defense claim, quote, I think the fact that she had been drinking was relevant to the self-defense issue and her perceptions, but to argue that she couldn't form the intent to do anything and at the same time argue that she could perceive that there was a threat on her life and she was reacting to said threat, that seems inconsistent to me. Do you see what I'm saying? Further, Miller testified that he did not think that voluntary intoxication is a good defense in general. Quote, I don't like it. I've used it before, but with very little success. End quote. So again, we have 2 attorneys that are basically saying, yeah, this is a defense that we could have used, but it wouldn't have made any sense to do it because you're expecting me to say, hey, the reason she acted this way was because she was so drunk. She was so drunk that she wasn't capable of really understanding anything that was happening to her. But then simultaneously, if I use Aileen's defense, which is self-defense, I have to also prove that not only was she so intoxicated she didn't know what was happening, she was somehow sober enough to understand that there was a specific threat on her life. So again, I think they made the appropriate call here, but that was something that was controversial, yet again, in the legal proceedings. In regards to Aileen owning and operating a weapon, Aileen stated that her job was inherently dangerous as she walked the highways looking for Johns. In some instances, she'd been beaten, raped, and even maced, which led to her carrying a gun as a form of self-defense, which explained why she had one in the first place. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Like, you see all the time that prostitutes are targets for some of the most heinous crimes because, as bad as it sounds, they get overlooked by not only law enforcement but society in general, and they are seen as expendable. So Aileen having a gun makes sense, but it also explains why all of the victims were ultimately shot, especially by a caliber of gun that she owned. Now, I do think it should be noted that the prosecution's star witness was actually Tyra, who stated that Aileen never said that Richard Mallory abused or raped her, that Aileen had no bruises and showed no signs of having been attacked. I'm going to caveat this with the fact that, based on Aileen's case, Tyra was more involved than she let on, and it's really difficult to believe and put a lot of stock in her recollections either. Especially because it's well documented that Aileen was a heavy drinker and used drugs, but Tyra was also a heavy drinker and used drugs, and she also had a prior criminal record. On top of that, when we get into Sims's case in particular, Tyra was observed at the scene of the crime. So I do firmly believe she had way more involvement than what we know, and she was covering her ass. So how much of what she's saying pertaining to the assault that Aileen experienced is true, we're not going to know. I think that she was covering her ass, so I'm not going to take her word for it that Aileen didn't have any injuries. Is it possible that Aileen lied about the whole thing? Yeah, like I said, she's a pathological liar. She could have lied about all of it. But I am more inclined to believe that story than I am when she talks about how she killed the 6 other individuals after Mallory. So, again, just lots of nuance to this case, and I want to be transparent with why I think certain things, but also, like, these are the facts of the case. I'm going to make my opinions based on the facts of the case, not by what the internet says and what the internet wants me to believe. So, Aileen moves on after Mallory, and her second victim is going to be David Andrew Spears, who is age 47 and a construction worker in Winter Garden. He was declared missing as of May 19th, 1990, and on June 1st, 1990, his naked body was found along U.S. Route 19 in Citrus County. He had been shot 6 times with, you guessed it, a .22 caliber pistol, which, you know, is the gun. It is the gun that Aileen tended to keep on her. The way his case works is that he actually drove to work, which was about 100 miles, if I remember correctly, about 100 miles away during the week. And then this was done exclusively to support his family. And then he would drive back home on the weekends to be with his wife and his 3 children. Like I said, he disappeared. He vanished off the face of the earth and was murdered during one of these drives home. He disappeared on the 19th. He wasn't found until the 27th. In fact, his body was so decomposed when he was found that dental records and x-rays were needed for identification purposes. As I said, he was killed with a .22 caliber handgun. In a local newspaper, Spears' manager stated that Spears would stop to assist anyone with a broken down vehicle and that he frequently assisted hitchhikers with their travels. So him seeing Aileen on the side of the road and picking her up, especially if she's posing as a hitchhiker, wouldn't have been that uncommon. So he is the second victim after Mallory. There's not as much information on him as I would like. Some are like that, unfortunately. But again, not an individual where you go, yeah, it really makes a lot of sense that she would kill him. Next, we move on to Charles Edmund Carskadden. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. He was age 40 and a part-time rodeo worker who was last seen alive on May 31st in 1990. Charles reportedly left his home in a Cadillac intending to take a trip to Tampa, Florida. On June 6, 1990, his naked body was found in Pasco County. He had been shot 9 times with a .22 caliber weapon. The body had been wrapped in an electric blanket and was badly decomposed. Witnesses allegedly saw Wuornos in possession of Karskaden's car, and Wuornos had pawned a gun identified as belonging to Karskaden. His vehicle and his contents were found in a separate location on June 6th or 7th in 1990. At this time, the car apparently was red tagged by the Florida Highway Patrol and ultimately was towed away on June 13th, but sheriff's officers later recovered it. So, a couple of things here that I really want to point out, okay? So, this crime in particular sticks out to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, I believe Karskaden was the one who was shot the most out of everybody. Shooting somebody 9 times is overkill. Shooting somebody 9 times is what you do out of anger to make sure that somebody is dead. You want them to be dead. It's not a, hey, I want to impair you so that you can't hurt me anymore. It's, I am going to kill you. So clearly the intention was not to injure somebody so that you could get away or you could go get help. The intent was to kill somebody. Again, with a .22 caliber weapon, which Aileen is known to carry. On top of that, Karskaden was the only body or the only victim that I know of who Aileen attempted to conceal. He was wrapped in an electrical blanket and then dumped. That signifies to me as somebody who knows that they did something bad, that it wasn't an act of self-defense, and that they needed to hide the evidence. This is different from what happened to Mallory, right? Mallory was just shot and then left where he was shot. Karskaden was shot and then covered up so that it would be harder to find him. So the intent here comes across as very different than what happened with Mallory. Very, very different than what happened with Mallory. So, again, we need to take note of some of these details because I'm a firm believer that the 6 men after Mallory that Aileen Wuornos killed, it was not because they tried to rape her, and it's not because they did rape her, it's because she was robbing them. And one of the best examples of this change in behavior is with Karskaden. Next, we move on to Peter Abraham Seams, who was age 65, and a retired merchant seaman and an active missionary. In June 1990, Seams left Jupiter, Florida for Arkansas. On July 4th, 1990, his car was found in Orange Springs, Florida. Tyra and Wuornos were seen abandoning the car, and Wuornos' handprint was found on the interior door handle. Seams' body has never been found. Witnesses stated that Aileen drove the vehicle approximately 3 or 4 miles away before abandoning the vehicle entirely. After Seams was murdered, it's reported that Aileen and Tyra, who was with her at the time, crashed when fleeing the scene. The crash was also witnessed. On top of that, multiple beer cans were found in Seams' car and at the crash site. If we recall, as I mentioned multiple times, Aileen was a heavy drinker and was heavily intoxicated at the time she killed Mallory. On top of that, she has a significant DUI history. So it's likely that she was drinking at the time of this crime too. It is very likely that Seams stopped to pick up Tyra and to pick up Aileen because they were hitchhiking. As for Seams' body, some actually speculate that he was eaten by alligators. Chief Littlebuck, who aided local law enforcement and who assisted in searching for Seams, stated that shortly after Seams' death, an unusual amount of buzzards were in the area. However, during the search, the area's ponds had refilled with water and were infested with alligators. Seams is documented as being a kind man who'd give you the shirt off of his back. Seams was described by friends and family as someone with a servant's heart. Somebody who would stop to assist someone with, a broken down car, somebody who was hitchhiking. And like I said, this is why I believe Tyra is more involved than what we know, because she was seen with Aileen driving the car that was Seams's, even though she claimed that she didn't really understand how Aileen got the car, but she was driving. It's a whole thing. It's just really stupid, and I am a firm believer that Tyra was more involved, and the prosecution cut her a deal so that she could put as much of the blame on Aileen as possible. That said, Aileen, in my opinion, is definitely the more dominant personality out of the two of them. As I've mentioned in other episodes, when you have co-defenders, you have more of a dominant individual and a submissive individual. Aileen is the one who's going to pull the trigger. Aileen is the one who's going to make the plans. Tyra's going to be there and Tyra's going to participate, but she's not going to call the shots. That's just my take on that. The next victim is Troy Eugene Barres, age 50, who was a sausage salesman from Ocala, Florida. On July 31st, 1990, he was reported missing. On August 4th, 1990, his body was found in a wooded area along State Road 19 in Marion County. He had been shot twice. Burress reportedly moved from Fort Lauderdale to avoid the growing population and crime rate, causing him to settle down in Central Florida City. It's reported that after Burress was killed, the cash in his wallet was taken and his body was dumped where it was later found. Burress was actively driving the sausage company truck at the time of his death, as it was later found abandoned on the side of the road. Burress was described as a good employee who abided by company policy. However, Burress was known to go against one particular policy, which was that you never gave people rides in the company truck. However, it was well known, and by other company workers as well as Burress's wife, that he often gave people rides in the company truck and was not afraid to help anyone that he deemed to be in need. Sharon Burress, his wife, is quoted as saying, quote, "He never knew a stranger, which might have been his downfall," end quote. Sharon elaborated that Burress never stopped to help a man, believing that a man could help himself, but he definitely went out of his way to assist women and children. So again, another instance where somebody who was good-natured stopped to assist someone that they believed to be in need and then was shot, killed, and robbed. Next, we have one of the more troubling ones, which is Charles Richard Dick Humphreys, age 56, who is retired United States Air Force major, former state child abuse investigator, and former chief of police. On September 12, 1990, his body was found in Marion County. He was fully clothed and had been shot 7 times in the head and torso. His car was found in Suwannee County. Humphreys was last heard from on September 11th around 4 p.m. The day before Humphreys vanished, he and his wife went out to dinner to celebrate their 35th anniversary. Humphreys' wife speculates that, given her husband's history, he likely would have stopped to help someone in need. He was too well trained to risk picking anyone up who he believed to be dangerous. Aileen was later quoted that she shot Humphreys 7 times to, quote, put him out of his misery, end quote. This one is particularly troubling because I think if there's any individual to say that, yeah, he didn't do that, it's this one. And I know people are going to be like, oh, well, of course a cop would be defending another cop as if cops don't sexually abuse people. Yes, there are cops that sexually abuse people. But the biggest point for me here is, number one, he was fully clothed. Fully clothed when he was found. Number two, he's the individual who was shot the second most times. And in military training and in law enforcement training, it is you do not get out of the fight until you're dead. You can get shot 32 times. As long as you're not dead and you're still breathing, you fight back. So it was going to take a large amount of gunfire to suppress this guy, because this dude had a shit ton of experience. He knows how to stay in the fight. He knows how to handle these things. He's probably mentally prepared for it for a very long time. And then Eileen's statement, which, quote, put him out of his misery, end quote, implies that she intentionally killed him. She saw that he was suffering, that she shot him multiple times and said, you know what, I'm going to kill him anyways. Except she's framing it as this mercy killing, when in reality, she didn't have to kill this guy in the first place. Then we move on to Walter Gino Antonio, age 61, who was a trucker and security guard and reserve police officer. On November 19th, 1990, Antonio's nearly naked body was found near a remote logging road in Dixie County. He had been shot 4 times. 5 days later, his car was found in Brevard County. Tyra later stated that Aileen gave her a diamond ring, which ended up being Antonio's, and had been taken off his body after Aileen murdered him. So I do want to talk about the fact that some of these individuals were found partially disrobed. Do I think it's possible that, yeah, they may have picked Aileen up for sexual favors? Sure. I can't really rule that out with them. Like I said, at least with Humphreys, he's fully clothed, right, when he dies. So the chances of that being a thing, slim to none. With the individuals who are either completely naked or half naked, I do think that's a little more likely. But at the same time, she's taking valuable belongings. She's taking a diamond ring and she's giving it as a trophy to her girlfriend. So there is another intention here, which is robbery, which she openly admits later. So again, I don't think that the rape narrative is really what happened. You guys can disagree with me if you want, but when you look collectively at the case as a whole, it reads very different than what the media wanted people to believe, which is that Eileen's this very sympathetic individual, which she is, but that every man in the universe that hitchhiked with her tried to rape her, and then she killed all of them. Next, we have Douglas Giddens. Giddens had a wife and son that depended on him. He was a struggling farmer who left town to take a $2,000 loan from a friend that could help him buy necessary fertilizer for the farm. When he went on this trip, he never returned. Giddens' car was found on April 6th, and his body was located nearby in the woods where he'd been shot to death by, you guessed it, a small caliber handgun. Giddens' wife struggled with his death, but promised to ultimately get the farm running the way Giddens would have wanted. Another suspected victim of Aileen is Curtis Reed, but his body has never been found along with some other John Does, so it's possible that there's even more people that Aileen killed. Now we're going to go ahead and jump into Aileen's arrest. Aileen Wuornos was arrested on January 9th, 1991 in the Last Resort bar. The arrest stemmed from an earlier failure to appear warrant. Prior to this, Aileen was under constant surveillance by officers Mike Joyner and Dick Martin, both of whom chatted with Aileen at the bar on January 8th and even bought her drinks. Aileen informed them that she was having issues with Tyra, who'd abandoned her and left her homeless. At this time, Tyra moved elsewhere. The bartender allowed Aileen to crash on a couch for the night, and officers made plans to meet with Aileen on the 9th, which was the day she was arrested. When Aileen was taken into custody, authorities did not mention the slayings across Florida. However, Aileen was later interviewed, as well as Tyra, who was not with Aileen at the time of her arrest. As I mentioned earlier, Aileen confessed to 7 murders despite being advised by her attorney not to do so. Aileen stated that Tyra was not involved with the killings and only knew details that Aileen had previously told her. Police reports state that upon interrogation, Aileen did not express remorse and is quoted as saying, quote, "I'll be famous and maybe I'll write a book," end quote. Tyra stated the reason she was not with Aileen at the time of capture is because she feared for her life. Tyra was quoted as saying, quote, "We lived together until approximately December 3rd, 1990, at which point I feared for my life and went to live at my parents' home in Ohio," end quote. Tyra stated this happened after she witnessed a news story pertaining to Siems's car, which they had wrecked. According to Tyra, it became clear to her that some of the cars Aileen was driving and had in her possession were obtained by foul play. Tyra also assisted police in gaining confessions from Aileen. Tyra informed Aileen that she was implicated in the murders and needed Aileen to clear her name, which led to Aileen confessing to several crimes. Tyra's information also assisted investigators in obtaining pawn receipts for items stolen from Siems's car and sold. Per Florida law, pawnbrokers are required to gain fingerprints from the people that they end up making deals with. And these fingerprints belonged to Tyra. And on top of it, not Tyra, Aileen. And on top of this, Tyra helped authorities unravel a lot of Aileen's aliases, which were Lee, Cami Green, Lori Grody, which was her aunt's name, and Susan Blahovec. During Aileen's initial confessions, she described to detectives what a, quote, normal day looked like for her versus a, quote, killing day. On a normal day, Aileen had anywhere between 10 to 12 Johns. Aileen openly admitted, quote, "I could have killed all of them, but I didn't want to," end quote. Aileen insisted she was actually a, quote, nice person, end quote, and that on a normal day, she and the Johns would, quote, just do it on the side of the road, end quote. However, on a killing day, Aileen stated her clients asked to go farther into the woods. Aileen interpreted this as a clear sign that they desired to hurt her. While in jail awaiting trial, a 44-year-old Arlene Prale adopted Aileen after seeing her photo in the newspaper. Arlene would go on to support Aileen through her trials. I didn't get too much into that because that to me is just weird as shit. But it is what it is, I guess. I find it so weird that you're going to adopt a grown-ass woman. I didn't even know that that was legally possible, but apparently it is. On January 14th, 1992, Aileen went to trial for the murder of Richard Charles Mallory. The trial, as you would have guessed, was salacious and a public spectacle, with many people deeming Aileen the, quote, queen of serial killers, end quote. Although previous convictions are normally inadmissible in criminal trials, under Florida's Williams rule, the prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence related to Aileen's other crimes to show a pattern of illegal activity. For instance, her previously discussed assaults, robberies, and additional armed offense. As a result, Aileen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death 4 days later. Again, I do find this hypocritical considering the fact that the judge did not allow the defense to introduce the fact that Mallory had previous rape conviction. But at this point, there's not much that can be done about it. I just think that it was really shitty. Throughout court process, Aileen's behavior became increasingly erratic as things progressed, to the point that her defense team requested competency and psychological evaluations for her. It was determined by a team of psychiatrists that Aileen had borderline personality disorder along with antisocial personality disorder, both of which we will discuss later. Despite the seemingly cut and dry nature of the trial, a point of contention was found, as I mentioned, when it was revealed that Richard Mallory had a prior conviction for attempted rape in Maryland. The prosecution would later claim that they didn't know about this, but I don't really believe them. I think that they definitely knew about it, and then they just chose not to bring it up. And then when the defense brought it up and the judge squashed it as evidence, they were like, oh, no harm, no foul. So, again, not great. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's going to pertain to Aileen, it's going to pertain to this guy, which is past behavior is indicative of future behavior. And it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pretty accurate assessment, meaning that if Mallory was convicted of attempted rape in the past, it is more than likely that he attempted to rape Aileen. In fact, while Mallory underwent treatment following his initial rape conviction, records are quoted as stating, "It was observed of Mr. Mallory that he possessed strong sociopathic trends." Again, this information was not permitted at trial. Despite these issues, Aileen was denied a retrial as judges deemed that her rights were not violated and that the outcome wouldn't be any different even if the evidence was admitted. That's why we got discussion about the voluntary or involuntary intoxication defense. On March 31st, 1992, Aileen pled no contest to the murders of Charles Richard Humphreys, Troy Eugene Barres, and David Andrew Spears. Eileen's justification for this was that she wanted to, quote, get right with God. At the time, Aileen became incredibly religious, asking that her death sentence be moved up so that she could meet God sooner. In her statement to the court, Aileen said, quote, "I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently rape me, as I've told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to," end quote. This directly contradicted her earlier statements that all of the men did rape her or all of the men tried to rape her. Aileen would go on to retract this sentiment even further, pertaining to the victims after Mallory, stating that they never tried to rape her in the first place. On May 15th, 1992, Aileen was given 3 more death sentences. In June 1992, Aileen pled guilty to the murder of Charles Edmund Carskadden, and then in November of 1992, she received her 5th death sentence. In February 1993, Aileen pled guilty to the murder of Walter Gino Antonio and was sentenced to death again. Unfortunately, though, there wasn't significant enough evidence to charge her with Siems's murder, because his body was never found. And no body cases are notoriously difficult. I think they could have proven it if they tried. But at this point, Aileen received 6 death sentences. So, I mean, there was really no necessity in doing that. And a lot of critics claimed that, like, the whole trial circuit was just for entertainment purposes and that it was overkill, which I, no pun intended, I can't necessarily disagree with. Because Aileen also found the consecutive death sentences ridiculous and actually expressed a sentiment that none of it really mattered because they could only kill her once. So, like, what was the point of the others? Despite all of these death sentences, Aileen bounced back and forth between wanting to be honest and then resorting to past lies. As I've stated multiple times in this episode, Aileen was a pathological liar, yet, as mentioned, one of the most consistent parts of her story is the fight over a gun with Mallory and the fact that he either did rape her or tried to rape her. However, Aileen, again, stated that the actions of the other 6 men weren't what she initially alleged. They did not sexually assault her. They did not try to sexually assault her. She actually ended up settling on a truth, which was she just wanted to rob them. After being placed on death row, Aileen naturally began the appeals process, which is automatic in just about every state that has the death penalty. But at a certain point, Aileen terminated her appeals as well as her legal counsel. In a recorded interview, Aileen stated, quote, "I killed those men, robbed them cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I am so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times, I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." End quote. I know that statement is controversial in and of itself because some people are like, well, of course she's going to say that. She wants the death penalty to scoot up sooner because she wants to die and she has some religious psychosis going on. Others are going to say, well, she's a pathological liar. How can you believe her? And I believe this statement in particular because the evidence of the other crimes is indicative that the 6 men after Mallory really did not assault her the way that she alleged. They don't have past criminal records. They were working in the middle of jobs, and Aileen openly hitchhiked. And these were all men who, according to friends and family, would pull over, would stop, would assist people that they saw in need. So I think it's likely that this is a true statement, and I think Aileen was coming clean here when she said that she did kill them, and that she was doing it to rob them. Because again, based on the evidence, she pawned multiple belongings of multiple of her victims. She gave a diamond ring to Tyra. There was a robbery motive, plain and simple. And I feel like people want to disagree with that because of the whole Mallory incident. And I think two things can be true at once, which is that Mallory was a bad person. Mallory tried to do bad things to her. She killed him. And then she robbed him. And then thought, hey, this is something that I could do and get away with. And then proceeded to do it for 6 other men and maybe more. Again, nuanced case. Nuanced issues. Aileen's legal team stated that she was not sane enough to make such legal decisions, such as terminating her pleas and her legal team. This resulted in a team of psychiatrists evaluating Aileen again, and they ultimately determined that while she had personality disorders, she was competent to make legal decisions. As Aileen's incarceration progressed, she deteriorated further. In 2002, Aileen began accusing prison staff of tainting her food with dirt, saliva, and urine, none of which was proven. Aileen stated she had overheard conversations among prison personnel, quote, trying to get me so pushed over the brink by them I'd wind up committing suicide before the execution, end quote, and, quote, wishing to rape me before execution, end quote. Aileen also filed complaints leading to strip searches, tight handcuffing, door kicking, frequent window checks, low water pressure, mildew on her mattress, and, quote, catcalling, in distaste and a pure hatred towards me, end quote. As a result of the alleged treatment, Aileen threatened to boycott showers and food trays when certain officers were on duty as she believed they were responsible for the dirt, saliva, and urine incidents. Quote, in the meantime, my stomach's growling away, and I'm taking showers through the sink of my cell, end quote. Aileen wrote a 25-page official complaint that was observed by the court, leading to a hearing for Aileen to basically just air out her claims. One of the complaints being that her potatoes were cooked in dirt, which I'm not really sure how that's possible. Potatoes come from dirt, but I don't know how you would cook them in dirt. Aileen's attorneys continued to question her competency, no surprise, arguing that some psychiatrists found Aileen to have paranoid delusions. This resulted in her attorneys stating, quote, if the allegations don't have any truth to them, she's clearly delusional. She believes what she's written, end quote, he said. Just before Aileen's execution, she agreed to several interviews with Nick Broomfield, a documentarian. During these interviews, Aileen alleged even worse abuse by prison staff, specifically that they were engaging in psychological warfare and using sonic pressure on her head. Aileen even alleged that she was being intentionally food poisoned in order to make her appear crazier when she complained to prison staff. During one of the many interviews with Nick, Aileen is quoted as stating that upon her death, she's, quote, being taken away to meet God and Jesus and the angels and whatever is beyond the beyond, end quote. Aileen then stated, quote, you sabotaged my ass, society and the cops and the system. A raped woman got executed and was used for books and movies and shit, end quote. Mind you, that Aileen agreed to all of these interviews. Aileen agreed again and again and again to be interviewed by people to give statements. Also, there was that earlier statement in an interview where Aileen said, oh, I'll be famous. They'll make a book out of me or a movie out of me. So again, conflicting sentiments here. Aileen's final on-camera words were, quote, thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass. Interestingly enough, this sentiment negates Aileen's admission that she murdered all of the men. And on top of murdering all men, she robbed all of the men, which included Mallory. Aileen's execution by lethal injection took place on October 9th, 2002. She actually declined her last meal, which could have been anything under $20, and instead just received a cup of coffee. Her last words were, quote, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back. I'll be back." End quote. She died at 9:47 a.m. So that's the case as a whole, a big fat overview of the case. What we're going to talk about now is some of the psychological issues, or basically the psychopathology of Aileen Wuornos, and how we can see it reflected in her case as a whole. And then we'll come to a conclusion on this video. So, according to some specialists, Wuornos' crimes have been related to her psychopathic personality and her traumatic past. Surprise. Aileen was assessed using the psychopathy checklist and scored a 32 out of 40 with the cutoff score of 30 for determining psychopathy. Aileen was also known to meet the relevant criteria for determining borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Aileen, in my opinion, and if you see footage of her, was very clearly mentally ill. And if we recall, her father had schizophrenia. Suicide very clearly ran in the family, along with other substance abuse. So it's likely that Aileen inherited some type of schizoaffective disorder, which we'll talk about, as well as a plethora of other mental health issues. I actually did, for my capstone project before graduating, I did research on the heritability of mental health disorders. Specifically how heritable it was, and if twins or multiple siblings could have different diagnoses and different things like that. It was very complex, super interesting. I kind of missed doing that research. But if I can recall correctly, granted this has been some time, most mental health disorders have a heritability that ranges from roughly 40% to 60%. And this is dependent on family genetics. So it could be higher. If both of your parents have depression, there's a significant chance that you as a child are also going to have depression. So these statistics they can be moved. The goalposts can be moved here. But the general consensus is that mental health issues are very heritable. They are very genetic. They get passed down at an exceptionally high rate. So taking that into consideration, it's not too surprising that Aileen ended up being the way that she did. So what exactly do these diagnoses mean? How do they apply to her? And kind of what would be the cause of that? So one thing we're going to look at is attachment theory. One explanation for Aileen's behavior and then her eventual diagnoses is attachment theory. And in short, attachment theory alleges that children who are neglected, abused, or in harmful households just learn to disassociate, be untrustworthy, hypervigilant, and just lack a complete and total, process of proper emotional regulation. They are unable to socially attach or communicate with their peers or society. And from a young age, Aileen experienced brutal physical and emotional abuse from her grandfather, Laurie. Okay, we went through that pretty good. I think we're on the same page there. And this was the man who, for a good long while, she thought was her biological father until proven otherwise. Which, that whole situation also leads to massive amounts of trust issues and likely hypervigilance. I'm going to quote a large section from a study which states that from the attachment theory perspective, this is what we believe Aileen was learning. A, I am wicked, worthless, and hated by those who are supposed to love me. Remember, he would say things to her while he beat her. B, those who are supposed to love me hurt me. C, life is filled with terror, rejection, and pain. And D, others cannot be trusted and I must be hypervigilant in order to protect myself from others, end quote. So that whole description might be an indicator of why Aileen's crimes happened the way that it did. It may be that the 6 men after Mallory were not trying to rape her at all. That's what I believe. I don't think they were trying to rape her at all. I think some of them may have tried to engage in prostitution with her, but I don't think they tried to rape her. However, due to past experiences that she had, she was hypervigilant about that being a danger and about that being a threat. That was always going to be in the back of her mind. And then you add that to her paranoia, and it's not, and this is, I don't know for sure if this has happened, but it's not unlikely to think that she concocted an inaccurate narrative of what their behavior and their intentions were. It may be that she interpreted their behavior as this precursor to rape when that legitimately wasn't what was happening at all. But that may also only be half of the truth, because Aileen killed to rob. There was intent behind some of her killings. I mean, like I said, you don't shoot people 9 and 7 times without intending to kill them, and then you don't accidentally end up in their belongings and then accidentally pawn it. So, as mentioned, it's likely that for at least the 6 men after Mallory, her intentions were always to rob them, but the escalation to murder may have also been fueled by like this weird hyper-vigilant combination of past trauma and then paranoia. Essentially, Eileen's experiences made it impossible for her to see men as really anything other than inherently hostile and without compassion at all, and that she would see their actions as something based on an ulterior motive of, oh, well, they're being nice to me, but I can't trust that they're being nice to me. And if you notice, a lot of the men that she ended up killing were people who genuinely were good people. You have the missionary, you have the security guard, you have the former military man, former police chief, current employee who's working against child abuse. You have the guy who was well known for picking up hitchhikers and giving them rides, even though he drove a sausage truck. Like, these are all people that would have been primed for the taking because they were so kind-hearted and because they wanted to help others. And it may have been that they had nothing but pure intentions. She wanted to rob them, and then her paranoia got the best of her, and then she killed them because she was like, oh, they're doing this and they're doing that, and I know what this means and I know what that means. So it might have just been a really bad cocktail of trauma, paranoia, and just an inability to communicate properly with people, as well as the intention that she was going to rob them, regardless of whether or not she killed them. There is some belief that she killed them to get rid of the evidence, which again is somewhat supported by the one individual that she wrapped in an electrical blanket. So, like I said, with Aileen, it's difficult because I don't think we're ever going to know the complete and total truth, but I think when we examine all of the pieces of her case, there are very clear indicators that her original sentiment that all of these men were rapists is just inaccurate, and it's not true. And I do feel bad that the internet has latched onto that in the way that it has, because those men don't deserve to have that as their legacy. So, anyways, continuing on, Aileen would have developed a firm belief that men are dishonest. And like I said, I think some of these speculations are true, but I also want to make it clear that, like, she still had a lot of agency when it came to her crimes. She still chose to kill people, she still chose to rob them, but again, I do think that some of her actions were influenced by negative childhood experiences, and at the very least, those experiences developed her psychological conditions. Next, we're going to get into psychopathy. One condition that Aileen was diagnosed with, as I mentioned, is psychopathy. So what does that look like outside of like the stereotypical Hollywood like crazy person? First and foremost, anyone can be a psychopath, even non-criminals. In fact, many successful CEOs are psychopaths because psychopathic traits benefit large-scale capitalism. However, the likelihood of meeting someone who's a psychopath just like out on the street in your daily life is not as likely as you would think, and it actually rises exponentially in prison, where 15 to 25% of inmates show psychopathic characteristics. Psychopathy, however, has historically had a few definitions and criteria, but there is a more recent model that's been developed, and it's called the triarchic model, which posits 3 separable trait ideas or constructs, which are known to underlie psychopathic symptoms. The first one is disinhibition, which is defined as something where people tend to be impulsive, irresponsible. They have a very big difficulty regulating their emotions, and they just have an inherent mistrust for others. The second is meanness, which involves a lack of empathy, a contempt toward other people, and an inability to bond with others. Predatory exploitativeness, again, that's something that would be very beneficial in capitalism. For instance, like conning people, setting ruses, or just being generally deceitful. And then the third one is boldness, which includes dominance, social assurance, emotional resilience, and then adventurousness. It should be noted that psychopathy isn't a diagnosis in the DSM. but rather a culmination of antisocial behaviors. So someone with antisocial personality disorder is more likely to be a psychopath, but that's not like an exclusive set of rules. Just because somebody has antisocial personality disorder, that doesn't make them a psychopath, if that makes sense. But this is just a trend that has been observed in science. So some of the most common psychopathic traits, which will overlap with antisocial personality disorder, are lack of empathy, impulsiveness and increased risk taking, inability to relate to and communicate properly with others, increased narcissism and narcissistic tendencies, difficulty with morality, distinguishing what is right or wrong or what is appropriate and inappropriate, a lack of remorse, and a lack of responsibility. We can see just about all of these traits exhibited in Aileen's criminal behavior, whether that was before the killings or after the killings. She did not express remorse. She did not have empathy for the families or anybody that she affected with her crimes, like I said, either before or after the killings. She impulsively consumed alcohol and drugs. She impulsively stole cars, guns. She shot a gun off in city limits. She committed multiple assaults. I mean, these are all traits that were documented well before she even started killing people. So the warning signs were there, but we also have to acknowledge that it was a different time back then and people weren't as aware of things as they are now. Next, we have antisocial personality disorder. According to a study in 1990 by Gabbard, psychodynamic theorists believe that ASPD, which is antisocial personality disorder, begins with a lack of parental love in infancy, which causes children to form a lack of trust in other human beings. As we know, Aileen was abandoned by both of her parents, and then her grandparents weren't exactly great people because of the physical and sexual abuse that was taking place. Individuals who develop ASPD react to such early neglect by becoming emotionally detached, and they learn to tolerate others through manipulation, power, and just overall destructiveness. This is documented in Aileen's early behaviors, such as resorting to prostitution at school to get what she wanted. Whether that was food or drugs or cigarettes. And then she very clearly, very clearly, did not have a problem being just destructive. Like, she crashed cars, she shot guns within city limits, she did armed robbery at a convenience store. Like, that was not something that she really hesitated to do. On top of that, Gabbard's study in 1990 states that childhood abuse, neglect, and the witnessing of violence are factors identified by many scholars as integral to the development of psychopathy/ASPD. We can safely assume that Aileen was exposed to extensive violence and was neglected based on earlier events that I discussed. So this, again, is not super surprising that this would be a diagnosis for her. There's also a documented strong connection between ASPD and violence, which helps explain why Aileen was as violent as she was at such a young age. For example, like I said, her assaults and her armed robberies. Now, some of the diagnostic markers for ASPD are as follows, and you'll notice there is a bit of overlap between these markers and psychopathic traits. First and foremost, failure to conform to laws and social norms. Repeatedly breaking laws. I mean, that's kind of implied in the name, like antisocial, you're going against society. Number 2, deceitfulness. So cons, lying, doing things that are dishonest for your personal gain or your personal pleasure. Number 3, we have impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. For instance, not thinking far enough ahead to maybe not go to a pawn shop where your fingerprints are going to be on everything when you have a prior prison record where you would have fingerprints. Like, things that should objectively make sense, but she was too impulsive to recognize or plan ahead for. Irritability and aggressiveness, repeated physical fights or assaults, check box on that one. Reckless disregard for safety of self or others. Yes, I mean, even before she killed anybody, we have DUIs, we have recklessly discharging a gun. Again, it's all there. Consistent irresponsibility, repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. Her biggest consistency at work was prostitution, but beyond that, didn't have a job, didn't go to school. There was no consistency to a schedule. There was no self-responsibility for, I'm going to be a productive member of society. I'm going to go do these things on this day and that day. No, like, I'm going to go to this interview and then this interview, or, I'm going to go to this dentist appointment and then this doctor's appointment. And then lastly, a lack of remorse. Being indifferent to hurting people, mistreating people, or stealing people. I think that one's pretty obvious, so I'm not going to go into that one too much more, because this video is already long enough. Then we have borderline personality disorder. As we move into borderline personality disorder, BPD, not to be confused with bipolar disorder, we'll notice another fair bit of overlap between what we've already discussed. Now, BPD is a mental health condition characterized by persistent patterns of instability in mood, self-image, and interpersonal relationships. Impulsivity often plays a role in borderline personality as it does in psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. So, another set of markers for BPD can be found in fear of abandonment as well as chronic, I think it's a chronic fear, or chronic feelings of fear is the correct verbiage. I miswrote it on my paper. And then individuals with BPD experience intense and rapidly shifting emotions and engage impulsive behavior, including recurrent self-harm and suicidality. Again, something very notable not only in Aileen's family, but in Aileen's own history. We also see in multiple videotaped interviews that her moods fluctuate quite regularly. She even had outbursts in court, and people said, who knew her in childhood, that she was a very angry kid who would be fine one moment and then would blow up and have an explosive temper the next. We can also see this just in the way that her crimes were committed, because some victims were shot once or twice, and then others were shot 9 or 7 times. So there's definitely indicators that this is something that applies to her. On top of that, BPD impacts an individual's interpersonal and occupational functioning, meaning people with BPD struggle to maintain normal social relationships, both romantically, platonically, and familially. All of those were very big, very clear issues with Aileen. Some with BPD even develop transient psychotic symptoms. And the current hypothesis surrounding BPD is that BPD is caused by genetic factors and adverse childhood experience. So, like, sort of the nature and nurture, but instead of one versus the other, it's just both. So, both of these things are documented as affecting brain development, which, again, makes sense when we look at Aileen. Next is something that I want to talk about that I mentioned, schizoaffective disorder. I want to discuss the possibility of this because I do think it's possible that Aileen had some type of schizoaffective disorder. And while I can't formally diagnose her, based on the research I've done here, my background, and then the recorded interviews, I think some of the symptoms appear applicable to her. So I do believe that it's worth discussing because I feel like it explains aspects of her paranoia. First and foremost, you have delusions, having false fixed beliefs despite facts showing that they're not true. For instance, the false fixed belief that, men are all evil, men are all dishonest, men are all going to kill you or all going to rape you. Hallucinations, such as hearing voices or seeing things that others don't observe. Now, I can't say for sure that she had hallucinations, but given the statements she made when she was in prison about people peeing in her food, spitting in her food, putting dirt in her food, cooking potatoes in dirt, that there was sonic pressure being used on her for psychological warfare, I feel that this is not too far off base. Then we have disorganized thinking and speech. Aileen consistently has a hard time not only staying on topic, but she talks in ways that are disorganized. Like her sentences cut off at weird points, or she starts in the middle of something and then jumps around. So again, possible. Bizarre or unusual behavior. She laughs in a lot of places where I feel like it's probably not great to laugh. She also seems to fluctuate quite regularly emotionally, which in and of itself is unusual behavior. Then you have symptoms of depression, such as feeling empty, sad, or worthless. Now, I would say that trying to kill yourself like 6 different times between 14 and 22 would be indicative of depression or feeling worthless, feeling that you're not good enough or that you don't want to be alive. Then we have periods of manic mood disorders with, somebody having more energy and less need for sleep over several days, or other behaviors that are out of character. I would say that sounds like something that would fit her just based on what I have seen in video footage. I don't know that for sure. Then you have having a hard time functioning at work or school or in social situations. That is very clearly something she struggles with. especially because she did not go to school frequently as a kid. And we already know that she struggles in social situations. And then lastly, problems managing personal care, such as not looking clean and not taking care in how one looks. I can't really say much on that one. I would say she did a pretty decent job, but also it's kind of hard when you're homeless and you're struggling like that to really have the means to take care of yourself, so I can't speak on that too much. Some other important factors include possible causes and influences on developing schizoaffective disorder. First of all, genetics. Schizoaffective disorder tends to run in families, and if we recall, her father did have schizophrenia. So again, something that is possible. If it is a genetic issue, this can be triggered by stress. Aileen had a very stressful life, basically from the moment she was born to the moment that she died. And then on top of that, it can be triggered by drug use or other illicit substance use, which again I think speaks for itself, knowing that she was an alcoholic on top of someone, as well as the fact that like she was using drugs as early as 11 and having sex as early as 11. Some additional talking points that I want to say before we close out is that some people really struggle to understand how Aileen's case became so iconic. And I think that's fair, because when you look at everything that I've talked about, like, she's not a good person. But I think the biggest driving force behind the popularity was the violence behind the crime, as well as her gender. Because it's well known that female serial killers don't operate on the same violent tendencies as their male counterparts. Are there exceptions to the rule? Yes, but like as a whole, tends to be very different. Women often kill people that they know. Typically like a spouse, an ex-spouse, a boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend, and they aren't as likely to kill other women. Whereas men are like, I'll kill another man and I'll kill another woman. Women are also known to be more comfort-oriented in their killings. They kill people so that they can have life insurance policies. They kill so that they can get rid of their husband to go live with their boyfriend that they have. And they also tend to be more organized and thoughtful in their crimes. They rely more on deceit, cons, poisons, or other methods of, like hiring a hitman for God's sake, rather than just, going out and hitting somebody over the head with a hammer to kill them. It's very, very different from what men do. And Aileen did not fit what people knew about female serial killers. Up until this point, there weren't really a lot of them, and if there were, they typically had a male counterpart. So she was an outlier. And so not only did she baffle the public, she baffled professionals as well. So a lot of professionals were super interested in the case itself, and then they would talk on it, and they would speak about it, and then that also drew a lot of public interest. Like, she was just very interesting because nobody had seen something like that before, especially from a woman. So that's why I think it became as iconic as it was. And I also think part of it is because she had such a terrible childhood. I think at the time it was really easy for people to look at like Ted Bundy, Jesus Christ, I can't say his name, which is fine because he sucks anyways. Like Jeffrey Dahmer, different things like that, where like there wasn't a lot of sympathy for them because they were so violent and because their crimes were so heinous. It was like, well, I don't care about this guy. This guy sucks. He murdered people and he had necrophilic tendencies and like all sorts of crazy shit. And Aileen wasn't like that. So I think people were a little more sympathetic to her and her situation, especially based on her history. Which draws me to my conclusion. Given everything that we talked about, this is what I'm taking away from it, okay? And I'm gonna make myself nice and big for this, okay? So we can sit and we can talk heart to heart. We're gonna scooch the camera over also. Here's my takeaway from this, okay? Number one, Aileen is not a good person. Aileen Wuornos is a violent, cruel person who did a lot of bad things to a lot of good people. She was very, very violent, and she did kill 6 innocent men. She did rob them as well, and she screwed over their families, people who were genuinely trying to help her. And she did do it via a ruse, and she did do it for robbery purposes. Not a good person at all, and she openly admits this, which I can respect. However, Aileen is also a very sympathetic person because she did not have a fair shake at life from the very beginning. And I would be remiss to not acknowledge that. She also did not get the help that she needed because, again, very different time back then. They weren't, like, 36 years later, we are much more aware of things like borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, signs and symptoms and traits within children that just are not appropriate, that should be red flags, that at the time nobody really cared about. So she definitely did not get the help that she needed, and that is partially why she ended up the way that she did. On top of that, she did have a lot of mental health conditions that influenced the outcome of her life. That said, she also still had a lot of agency in the decisions that she made. She still chose to be a violent individual, to rely on those impulses and those tendencies. So again, there's duality here. She is a sympathetic individual, and it is okay to feel bad for her. I feel bad for her. I don't think anybody should have had the childhood that she did. Nobody deserves that. At the same time, it does not give you an excuse to grow up and kill people the way that she did. On top of that, there's the whole Mallory situation. And I've spoken in the video about that, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But what I dislike is seeing people act like she's a saint, like she's a hero, and she's this feminist girl boss individual, because that's just not true. Even if we take out the murders that she did, let's say everybody disagrees with me and they still believe very firmly that all 7 of these men raped her. That doesn't excuse the violent behavior that she still had before she killed people, where she was committing armed robbery, where she did have DUIs, where she beat her elderly husband with his cane, where she beat a bartender with a pool cue ball. Not a feminist icon, not the type of person that you should put on a pedestal. And some people may say, oh, well, it's just harmless. It's, it's like a trend. I disagree. I think that it's inappropriate and I don't like it. I think we should be careful with the things that we do, because realistically, if somebody was doing that trend with Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy, it'd be a very different story. And the reason that people can get away with it with Aileen is because she is a woman and because she is such a sympathetic individual. So I do think that there is a lot of nuance here. I hope that I did a good job breaking down the case for you guys, making it clear, like, what is the case itself, what is my opinion and my takeaway, but also, like, at the end of the day, this is just how the case is laid out. If you disagree with me, that's okay. I don't expect everybody to agree with me all the time, but I would love to know your thoughts, feelings, and opinions down in the comments. Again, I'm going to be jumping back into the Epstein files soon, so stay tuned for that. I'm trying to continue to read through stuff to get some more documents that I can upload to Discord and then show you guys, because right now I'm in a little bit of a drought because a lot of it is just repetitive stuff that I've already read and I don't want to beat a dead horse. Anywho, if you want to get notified when I upload, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. My knuckles just popped. I'm sorry for that. Maybe that was a little bit of ASMR. And I will see you guys in the next video. So please take care of each other, stay safe, behave yourselves, and stay psyched out.